Hello everyone. What happens when the safest place for the woman Alex loves is no longer her own home, but his, and taking one frightened step into his world begins to feel less like accepting help and more like crossing into a life neither of them can pretend is temporary anymore. If your heart still aches for the kind of love that becomes real only when fear leaves no room for distance, stay with me. Morning light lay thin and pale across the farmhouse, but it could not soften what had already happened there. The photograph was still in Alex's hand. The second shadow at its edge seemed to darken the whole room, as if one hidden figure could change the meaning of every familiar corner. Tuna sat on the bed with Henry against her shoulder, his small body finally growing heavier with tiredness after too much crying, too much clinging, too much fear for a child only 1 year old, and far too young to understand why his mother's heartbeat had become so unsteady. He did not speak. He did not walk. He only knew warmth and closeness, the smell of milk and soap, the rhythm of the woman who held him. And now even that rhythm had been shaken. Alex looked from the photograph to Tuna, and for one terrible second he saw with unbearable clarity how easily this little life could be broken, not by force alone, but by pressure, by fear, by being watched too closely for too long. He had wanted to enter her world with patience. Now danger had already entered first. There was no room left for hesitation, because after the photograph, after the note, after the second shadow standing too close to the house, one truth remained with frightening simplicity. Tuna and Henry could not stay here, and the only place Alex trusted enough now was the place closest to himself. Alex set the photograph down carefully on the table as though roughness toward paper might somehow deepen the violence already hidden in it. Then he turned back to Tuna. "You're coming with me," he said. The words were quiet. That made them heavier. Tuna's fingers tightened around Henry's back. The baby stirred at the change in her body and gave a weak little complaint without opening his eyes. She lowered her face at once and kissed the top of his head. Whispering soft sounds meant more for comfort than meaning. Alex waited. He knew better than to press too quickly when fear had already taken so much from her this morning. But he also knew that waiting too long could become its own kind of failure. "You and Henry can't stay in this house," he said. "Not after this." Tuna looked toward the front room, toward the thin curtains, the chipped cups on the table, the bowl she had meant to warm again for Henry. All the small, ordinary pieces of her life were still here. That was the cruelty of it. The house had not changed shape. It still looked like the place where she washed Henry's little shirts, fed him on the low step outside, soothed him after sleep, and measured out calm, one simple routine at a time. But someone had watched those routines and turned them into vulnerability. Leaving felt like grief. Going with Alex felt like something else. Something she was even less prepared to name. "If I go with you," she said softly, "that won't look like hiding anymore." Alex held her gaze, then let it look like safety. The answer was too steady, too simple. It nearly frightened her more than hesitation would have, because there was no embarrassment in him, no awkwardness, no careful attempt to make the decision smaller than it was. Bringing her and Henry into his space clearly meant something to him, and yet he was willing to let that meaning stand in full daylight if it kept them safe. Henry made another sleepy, unhappy sound. Tuna adjusted him higher on her shoulder. One tiny sock had slipped nearly off again, and without thinking she bent her wrist awkwardly to pull it back into place while still supporting his weight. Alex saw that, then crossed the room at once. "Sit," he said gently. "I'll get what he needs." Tuna looked up, startled by the certainty in his tone. Alex had already turned toward the shelf. He gathered the spare shirt, the little cloth Henry liked to hold when falling asleep, the blue blanket, the tin of powder, the bottle, the milk. He did not ask where anything was unless he truly had to. He simply noticed. The domestic precision of that undid something quiet inside her. "You don't have to know all this," she murmured. It did not stop moving. "I know enough." The room fell still after that, broken only by the faint rustle of fabric and Henry's soft, drowsy breathing. Tuna watched him fold Henry's blanket more carefully than some people handled expensive clothes. He checked the bottle lid, tightened it, set it upright in the bag. He reached for the extra bib, paused and chose the softer one instead. Such a tiny choice. Such an intimate one, the kind only someone paying close attention would make. This was what frightened her most about going with him. Not impropriety, not appearances, not even gossip. It was the terrible tenderness of seeing how easily he already made space for them. "Alex," she said after a long moment, "if I go to your house..." He turned. She could not finish at first. The thought felt too exposed in her mouth. Henry's warm cheek rested against her neck, grounding her and making the next words hurt more. It won't be temporary in the way things used to be. He understood immediately. There had been a time when he could visit the farm and leave, could stand at the edge of her life under the polite name of concern, friendship, help. That delicate distance had already been wounded before today. This morning threatened to erase it completely. "No," he said, "it won't." Tuna closed her eyes for 1 second. There it was. No evasion, no false modesty, no pretending that bringing a woman and her baby into his home was a casual arrangement. He would not insult her by making it small. Henry shifted again, his tiny hand opening and closing weakly against her collar. She looked at him and felt the old instinct rise at once, fierce and immediate. Protect first, pay the emotional cost later. But another feeling was there too now, quieter and more dangerous. A grief that the path towards safety might also be the path that made everything between her and Alex too real to step back from. Alex came closer, slower this time. "Tuna," he said, "this isn't me asking for more than you can give. This is me telling you I don't trust this house with your safety anymore." She looked up at him. "And if I trust you," she whispered, "what happens then?" The question was about much more than the morning. Alex's face changed only slightly, but enough. A man could hide many things in silence. Not this. "Then you trust me," he said, "and I carry what comes with that." The words landed low in the room, almost like a vow spoken before either of them had agreed to call it one. Henry suddenly whimpered and twisted with the fretful discomfort of a baby, too tired, too hungry, too overset to stay asleep easily. Tuna swayed him on instinct, but Alex was already moving toward the porridge bowl she had left earlier. "He should eat a little before we go," he said. She nodded. For the next few minutes, fear and tenderness lived side by side in the simplest way possible. Tuna sat in the chair near the bed. Alex rewarmed the porridge. He tested the heat against the back of his wrist before bringing it over. Tuna shifted Henry into the crook of one arm and tried to feed him with the other, but the baby fussed, turning his face into a shoulder, unwilling to settle. Alex crouched a little to make himself less looming. "Let me hold the bowl." The intimacy of that almost stalked her. Then she surrendered the bowl without speaking. He held it steady while she coaxed a few reluctant spoonfuls into Henry's mouth. The baby swallowed sleepily, a little porridge catching near his lip. Tuna wiped it away with the cloth. Henry blinked, confused, then leaned more weakly against her and accepted 2 more spoonfuls before he was done. It was not much, but it was enough to keep the morning from becoming crueler on his small body. This, too, was what made everything feel irreversible, not declarations. A man kneeling in quiet morning light, holding a bowl while a tired mother fed her frightened child. When Henry finally sagged against her again, Alex rose. "I'll bring the car close." Tuna caught his wrist before she meant to. He stopped instantly. For one stunned moment, both of them looked at her hand on him. Then she let go, cheeks paling slightly. "Don't be long," Alex's voice lowered. "I won't." While Alex moved outside, Tuna changed Henry's shirt. His first one had become damp with sweat and tears. He protested the cold air against his skin with a thin little cry, kicking weakly, not standing, not turning away with any real strength. Just flinching and scrunching his face in sleepy misery as babies do when the world has been too much for too long. Tuna kissed his stomach once as she pulled the fresh shirt down over him, a small automatic comfort. Henry's fussing softened for half a second. She wrapped him in the blue blanket afterward, even though the morning was not cold. He settled more quickly when bundled, as if the pressure itself reminded him of being held. By the time Alex returned to the doorway, she was ready in the practical sense. The diaper bag was zipped, the bottle packed. The photograph and note had been placed in an envelope. Alex kept with him. The ring box still sat on the table. Tuna saw it and went still. Alex followed her gaze. Neither moved immediately. That small velvet box had changed shape in the story between them. It was no longer only a hidden promise. It was now also a wound. A proof that someone had seen too deeply into Alex's intentions and touched them with dirty hands. I should leave it, Tuna said. Alex looked at the box for a moment, then shook his head. No. He crossed the room, picked it up, and placed it carefully into the inner pocket of his jacket. The movement was brief, controlled, but the meaning of it seemed to echo through the silence. Not abandoned, not exposed, kept close, protected. Tuna turned away first. When Alex reached for the bag, she finally said the thing that had been pressing against her since he asked her to leave with him. If I go there, to your house, your mother will see. He understood the real question beneath that at once. This was not only about safety, it was about being seen in a new role. A woman arriving not as a guest for tea, not as a visitor passing through, but carrying a child, carrying fear, carrying the unmistakable evidence that Alex had taken responsibility for her in a way no polite explanation could make ordinary. Yes, he said, and people will talk. Maybe. Tuna looked down at Henry, now heavy and half asleep again in her arms. His tiny fist rested under his chin inside the blanket. He looked heartbreakingly peaceful for the first time all morning, precisely because he was being held so close. Alex stepped nearer. I'm not asking you to come because it's easy, he said. I'm asking because I would rather let people talk than let you stay here 1 hour more. Her throat tightened. There were so many reasons to resist. Pride, caution, the habit of surviving alone, the fear that stepping fully into his world would change how impossible it would feel to ever step out again. Then Henry's lashes fluttered. He gave a small, restless cry without waking, and his body curled more tightly into her. That decided it. Slowly, Tuna nodded. The shift in Alex was subtle but unmistakable, like a man taking a breath only after he has held it too long. He did not smile. There was nothing light enough for that, but some deeper certainty settled in him at once. All right, he said softly. Come. He took the bag. She carried Henry. Together they walked through the front room, past the table, past the untouched tea, past the little life that had been interrupted but not yet abandoned. At the doorway, Tuna stopped and looked back once. The bowl, the chair, the curtain still moving by the window. Her chest hurt with the simple violence of leaving a house that still looked like home. Alex did not rush her. After a second, she stepped outside. The yard seemed too bright. Morning sun touched the fence, the gate, the path where she had so often stood rocking Henry after his naps. The place had once felt small and safe. Now it felt exposed from every angle. Alex opened the car door for her first, then paused. Sit in the back with him. He'll settle better. She stared at him for 1 second, then nodded again. Another tiny domestic detail. Another painful proof that he had already been paying attention. Inside the car, Tuna cradled Henry against her chest and leaned back carefully. The baby stirred, gave one brief, unhappy cry at the change of position, then quieted when she tucked the blue blanket tighter around him and rested a cheek on his head. Outside, Alex placed a bag in the front and circled to the driver's side. Just as his hand reached the door handle, his phone rang. Unknown number. The morning seemed to stop. Alex looked at the screen once before answering. His voice when he spoke was flat and low. Who is this? The voice that replied was male, calm, and far too familiar now. So, the man said. She agreed in the end. Alex's grip tightened around the phone. Inside the car, Tuna could not hear every word, but she saw the change in his face at once. The voice continued almost pleasantly. Now you're finally bringing them where I wanted. Alex did not move. The yard, the house, the car, the morning light, everything held still around those words. Tuna's blood ran cold. Henry shifted in her arms, sensing the shot that shot through her before she could hide it. His little face scrunched and he made a soft, complaining sound, not yet fully crying, only unsettled by the tremor in the chest beneath his ear. Alex spoke with great control. Say that again. A faint laugh answered him. Now you're truly placing them in my hands. The line went dead. For 1 long second, nobody breathed. Then Alex yanked the rear door open and looked straight at Tuna. We're not going to my house. Her face drained of color. What? He leaned one hand against the top of the door, every decision in him suddenly moving at once. He expected it. Maybe wanted it. I'm not driving you anywhere predictable. The words struck her with the cold force of logic. Of course, If someone knew Alex's heart this well, if someone could predict his instincts, then the most obvious sanctuary might also be the first place watched. Henry let out a sharper cry now, jolted fully awake by the tension and movement. Tuna gathered him tighter, whispering, rocking as much as the small space allowed. The baby's face crumpled, tears spilled instantly. He clung to her with blind desperation, unable to understand roads or threats or strategy, only that the adults around him would become frightened again. Alex shut his eyes briefly at the sound, then opened them harder than before. "Listen to me," he said. "I need you to trust me for the next 10 minutes without asking everything yet." Tuna stared at him, fear and helplessness fighting in her face. Then she looked at Henry. At his wet lashes, his tiny shaking mouth, the blanket bunched around him from her frantic arms. She nodded. Alex stepped back, phone already in hand again, dialing someone from memory. When the call connected, his tone changed. Not warmer, not calmer, but precise, decisive. "Prepare the old riverside house," he said. "No staff, no drivers, no one talks. I'll be there directly." He ended the call and got behind the wheel. Tuna had never heard of the place. That frightened her. And yet there was something about the speed and certainty of his choice that kept her from collapsing into questions. This was no longer only about being protected by Alex. It was about surviving the fact that someone out there understood him well enough to anticipate even his love. As the car pulled away from the farmhouse, Tuna looked back one last time through the rear window. The little house grew smaller. The curtains, the porch, the gate, the yard where she had fed Henry in sunlight. All of it receded, carrying with it the last shape of the ordinary life she had been trying so hard to preserve. Henry cried until the road smoothed out and her hand found the slow, familiar rhythm on his back again. Little by little, the cries broke into hiccups, then into weak, exhausted sounds. She bent her head and murmured to him, even while her own eyes burned. In the front seat, Alex drove without wasted motion, but his mind was moving faster than the road. The caller had not sounded triumphant, only sure. That was worse, because somewhere inside the trap closing around them was a person patient enough to study him, bold enough to touch Tuna's life, and cold enough to wait until she finally agreed to come closer, before revealing that closeness itself might have been part of the design. The road curved ahead, and for the first time since morning began, Alex understood that protecting Tuna and Henry would not only require strength, it would require becoming harder to predict than the man their enemy believed he already knew. Tuna agreed to go with Alex because fear had finally stripped away every safer illusion, and for one fragile moment it seemed that stepping into his world might be the only way to protect Henry. But the call that comes at the edge of departure turns that decision into a new terror, revealing that someone may have expected Alex to bring them home. Now love, protection, and danger are bound together more tightly than ever, with Henry crying in his mother's arms as the path ahead changes again. And as Alex drives them somewhere no one should know, the question darkening the road is no longer only who is watching them, but how deeply that watcher already understands the shape of his heart.